The throne room of the Blood Moon Palace stood silent as death itself, a cavernous hall of black marble and crimson tapestries that seemed to drink in the light from 1,000 torches. Every wolf present kept their eyes fixed firmly on the floor, their necks bared in submission, their hearts hammering against their ribs like prisoners desperate to escape. The air itself felt heavy with fear, thick enough to choke on, because today was a judgment day, and judgment from Alpha King Kale Blood Moon meant only one thing. Blood would be spilled before the sun set, and everyone in that room knew it, with the certainty that came from witnessing his cruelty for decades. The accused stood in chains at the center of the hall, 3 wolves from the Eastern Territories charged with poaching on royal lands, their bodies already bearing the marks of the king's interrogators, their spirits broken before they ever reached this moment. But it wasn't the condemned who held everyone's attention now. It was the young woman who had just entered through the side doors, her healer's robes marking her as an Omega from the sanctuary districts, her auburn hair catching the torchlight like living flame as she walked forward with a steady gait that seemed impossible given the circumstances. Alara Nightshade had been summoned to testify about the injuries she had treated on one of the accused, a simple matter that should have required nothing more than a few words confirming dates and wounds. But as she approached the dais where the Alpha King sat upon his throne of bones and black iron, she felt something shift in the air around her. The king himself was exactly as the stories described, a massive figure who seemed carved from violence itself, his dark hair falling past his shoulders in waves that framed a face too beautiful to belong to something so deadly. His eyes were the color of molten silver, cold and merciless, and they fixed upon her with an intensity that would have sent any sensible wolf running for the hills. But Alara had stopped being sensible the moment she decided to become a healer, the moment she chose to see the humanity in every creature that came to her. Even the monsters. She had treated rogues and outcasts, criminals and victims alike, because pain was pain, and suffering deserved compassion regardless of who experienced it. So when she reached the prescribed distance from the throne, and every instinct in her body screamed at her to lower her gaze, to submit, to disappear into the background like everyone else, she did the unthinkable instead. She looked directly into the Alpha King's eyes and spoke his name. Not his title, not Alpha King or Your Majesty, or any of the formal addresses that protocol demanded. Just his name, simple and human and real. Kyle. The single word fell into the silence like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled crowd. Wolves gasped. Some actually whimpered in terror at her audacity, convinced they were about to witness her immediate execution. The beta standing to the king's right actually took a step forward, his hand moving toward his weapon, ready to strike her down for the insult. But Kale himself simply went very still, his silver eyes widening just a fraction, something flickering in their depths that might have been surprise, or might have been something far more dangerous. For a long moment that stretched into eternity, he said nothing, did nothing, just stared at this Omega, who had either extraordinary courage or a death wish. Then, slowly, deliberately, he leaned forward in his throne, his massive frame somehow becoming even more imposing as he brought his full attention to bear upon her. His voice when it came was like gravel and smoke, dark and deep, and carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Who gave you permission to address me so informally, Omega?" The question was spoken softly, almost conversationally, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying than if he had shouted. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as his power filled the space, his alpha aura pressing down on every wolf present with crushing force. Alara felt it like a physical weight, trying to drive her to her knees, her Omega instincts screaming at her to submit, to apologize, to beg forgiveness. But she had not come this far, survived this much, only to crumble now. She had seen too many wolves broken by fear, too many lives destroyed by the tyranny that ruled their world, and she was tired of watching injustice parade as law. So instead of backing down, instead of lowering her gaze and offering the pretty lies that might save her life, she spoke the truth that had been burning in her chest since the moment she walked into this room. "No one gave me permission. she said clearly, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her insides. "But that is who you are, is it not? Before you were a king, before you were a monster in the stories we tell. To frighten children, you were just Kale, a wolf with a name and a heart and a soul." The words hung in the air like an accusation, like a prayer, like a challenge that no one in living memory had dared to voice. "If you have come here to hear my testimony about the healing I provided, then I will give it honestly. But I will not pretend that the wolf sitting on that throne is something other than what he is. You bleed when cut. You hunger when unfed. You feel pain and loss and grief just like any other creature. Calling you by your title does not change that truth. It only makes it easier for everyone to forget that you are not a force of nature, but a choice, a series of choices, and you could choose differently if you wished." The silence that followed her words was absolute, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm breaks and destroys everything in its path. Kale Bloodmoon had not moved, but something in his expression had shifted, a crack appearing in the mask of cold. Indifference he wore like armor. His eyes, those terrible silver eyes that had watched kingdoms fall and enemies burn, were fixed on her with an intensity that felt like being seen for the first time in her life. Truly seen, stripped of all pretense and protection. She thought she saw his hand tighten on the armrest of his throne, the only sign that her words had landed like blows against whatever lay beneath his carefully constructed exterior. Around them, the court held its collective breath, waiting for the explosion, for the violence, for the end that surely must come when someone dared to speak truth to power. The beta had his weapon drawn now, waiting for the signal to strike, but Kale raised one hand in a gesture that froze everyone in place. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer, almost curious, as if he were examining some strange and unexpected creature that had wandered into his domain. "You speak of choices as if you understand what mine have been," he said. Slowly, "You stand there in your healer's robes, safe in your sanctuary, and presume to lecture me on humanity. Tell me, Omega, how many wars have you fought? How many traitors have you faced? How many times has someone you trusted driven a knife into your back while smiling to your face?" The questions were not rhetorical but genuine, and Alara heard the pain beneath them, the old wounds that had never healed, because no one had ever been allowed close enough to tend them. She took a breath, knowing that her next words would either save her or condemn her, and chose honesty over survival. "I have fought no wars," she admitted. "I have betrayed no one, and been betrayed by many. I have watched wolves die in my arms because I lacked the skill or resources to save them. I have held the hands of orphans whose parents were executed for crimes they may or may not have committed under laws so harsh that mercy has become a forgotten word. I have seen what your reign has created, Kale Bloodmoon, and I have spent every day of my life trying to heal the wounds it leaves behind. So no, I do not understand your choices. I cannot comprehend what drives a wolf to rule through fear and pain and death. But I understand that you are making those choices every single day. And that means you could make different ones. That is not presumption. That is simply fact. Before anyone could react, before the king could respond or the beta could strike, the doors at the far end of the throne room burst, open with a crash that echoed like thunder. A messenger stumbled in, his fur matted with blood and dirt, his eyes wild with panic as he collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. The entire court turned to stare at this interruption, this breach of protocol that would normally result in immediate punishment. But the messenger's words stopped everyone cold. "Attack," he wheezed, his voice breaking with exhaustion and terror. "The northern border, rogues and something else, something ancient. They are slaughtering everything in their path. 3 packs have already fallen, and they are moving toward the capital." The message was impossible, ridiculous even, because the northern territories were the most fortified in the kingdom, protected by the most elite warriors Kale had personally trained. Nothing could break through those defenses. Nothing should have been able to coordinate an attack of that magnitude. But the blood on the messenger was real. The fear in his eyes was genuine, and when Kale rose from his throne with the fluid grace of a predator sensing danger. Every wolf in the room felt the shift from judgment to war. He moved down the dais steps with lethal purpose, his entire bearing transforming from seated monarch to warrior king in the space of a heartbeat. "How many?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "How long until they reach the outer districts?" The messenger's answer came between gasping breaths, painting a picture of devastation that sent ripples of fear through the assembled crowd. "Thousands, my king. Possibly more. They move like a coordinated army, but fight like berserkers without fear of death. We have perhaps 3 days. Maybe 4, if the mountain passes slow them." Some of the scouts who survived said they saw wolves fighting alongside creatures from the old stories, shadow beasts and things with too many teeth, and at their head rides a female with eyes like hellfire who speaks in tongues we have not heard in 1,000 years. She calls for your head specifically, demands that the blood moon line end in fire and ash, as payment for old debts. The description sent a chill down Alara's spine, because she knew those stories. Every healer learned them as part of their training in the ancient ways. The shadow beasts were creatures of pure malice that had been banished beyond the veil centuries ago, sealed away by the combined power of the first Alpha Kings and their mate queens who wielded magic that had been lost to time. If they had returned, if someone had found a way to break those ancient seals, then the entire kingdom faced extinction, not just defeat. Kale's expression had gone from cold to absolutely glacial, his eyes blazing with silver fire as power rolled off him in waves that made the torches flicker and the very stones beneath their feet tremble. He turned to his beta, issuing orders with the precision of someone who had commanded armies for longer than most wolves had been alive. "Mobilize every warrior we have. Recall the border patrols. Evacuate the outer districts and bring everyone behind the inner walls. Send word to the allied packs that we invoke the old treaties. This is not a territorial dispute but a threat to every wolf that draws breath. And find me the scholar wolves, the ones who study the forbidden histories, because I need to know what we are facing and how our ancestors defeated it before." The beta saluted and moved immediately to carry out the commands, taking half the court with him in a flurry of organized chaos. Wolves scattered to their assigned tasks, the machinery of war grinding into motion with practiced efficiency. But Kale's attention had already shifted back to Alara, who still stood in the center of the hall, somehow forgotten in the sudden crisis. Their eyes met across the distance, and she saw something in his gaze that she could not quite name. A calculation, a consideration, or perhaps just curiosity about the Omega who had challenged him. Moments before disaster struck. "You," he said, pointing one long finger in her direction. "You spoke of healing wounds and understanding pain. The sanctuaries have archives, old texts that the scholar wolves might not possess, because they were deemed too mystical, too tied to the Omega magic that the Council banned decades ago. I need access to those texts, and I need someone who can read them and understand what they say about the shadow beasts and how to send them back beyond the veil. Will you help save the kingdom you seem to despise, or will you let your principles watch it burn?" The question was a challenge and a test, and Alara knew that her answer would define everything that came after. She could refuse, could walk away and return to her sanctuary and pretend that the coming war was not her concern, that the sins of the king did not require her participation in their redemption. But she had become a healer because she believed that life was sacred, that every creature deserved a chance at survival, and that meant she could not stand by while thousands died simply because she disliked the one leading the defense. So she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and gave the only answer her conscience would allow. "I will help," she said clearly, "not because I support your reign or approve of your methods, but because innocent lives hang in the balance, and I have the knowledge that might save them. But I have conditions." The assembled wolves who remained in the throne room gasped at her audacity, at the sheer nerve of an Omega attempting to negotiate with the Alpha King during a crisis, but Kale surprised them all by nodding slowly. A ghost of something that might have been respect flickering across his features. "Speak your conditions," he said. "If they are reasonable, I will consider them." Alara took a breath and spoke the words she had been holding in her heart since the moment she walked into this place of judgment and cruelty. "The wolves you were about to condemn for poaching. They were feeding their starving packs because the tribute system you enforce takes so much that they cannot survive the winters. Their crime was desperation, not malice. Grant them clemency, send food to the Eastern Territories, and reform the tribute laws so that wolves are not forced to choose between loyalty and survival. Do this, and you will have my full cooperation and access to every text, every scrap of ancient knowledge the sanctuaries possess." The silence that followed was deafening, because what she had just demanded was not a small favor, but a fundamental challenge to the entire system Kale had built his reign upon. The tribute system was designed to keep the outer territories weak and dependent, unable to mount any challenge to the throne, a tool of control that had served him well for decades. To reform it would be to admit weakness, to show mercy in a kingdom where mercy was seen as the first step toward downfall. Every eye in the room was on the king now, waiting to see if he would strike her down for her presumption, or if the impossible might actually occur. Kale stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, his eyes searching her face as if trying to understand what manner of creature would risk everything for strangers she had never met. Then, slowly, deliberately, he descended the remaining steps until he stood before her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his massive frame, close enough that his scent of pine and smoke and something wild filled her senses. When he spoke, his voice was low, meant only for her ears, and it carried a weight of something that might have been regret, or might have been exhaustion. "You drive a hard bargain for someone with no leverage," he said softly. "But you are right that desperate wolves make poor subjects, and that starving packs are more likely to join with invaders than defend against them. I will grant your conditions, Omega, not because you have moved my heart with your pretty speeches, but because strategic wisdom demands it. The tribute laws will be reviewed and reformed. Food will be sent to the Eastern Territories immediately, and the condemned will be assigned to the defense forces where they can prove their loyalty through service rather than die as examples. Are you satisfied?" Alara searched his face, looking for deception or manipulation, but found only a strange kind of sincerity beneath the layers of calculated ruthlessness. She nodded slowly, aware that she had just witnessed something unprecedented, a moment where the terrible Alpha King had bent, even slightly, to the will of another. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I will gather what we need from the sanctuary archives and return within the hour." But Kale's hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her wrist with surprising gentleness, given the strength she knew he possessed. Stopping her before she could turn away, his touch sent a shock through her system. A spark of recognition that her Omega instincts seized upon with desperate hunger, whispering impossible things about bonds and fate and destinies she had no business entertaining. "You will not return to the sanctuary," he said, his voice rough with something she could not identify. "It is too dangerous, and I cannot spare warriors to escort you through streets that may soon be under attack. You will remain here in the palace, under my protection, and my people will retrieve whatever texts you require. This is not negotiable, Omega, because you have made yourself valuable, and I protect what is mine." The possessive edge to his words should have frightened her, should have sent her running for the exits, but instead, it stirred something deep and primal in her chest, a response she had no business feeling toward the tyrant king everyone feared. She pulled her wrist from his grip, needing the distance to think clearly, to remember who she was, and who he was, and all the very good reasons they should remain nothing more than temporary allies against a common threat. "I am not yours," she said firmly, "but I will stay if it means faster access to the information we need. However, I will require quarters suitable for research, access to your scholar wolves so we can coordinate our efforts, and your word that no harm will come to anyone from the sanctuaries while I am here." Kale's lips curved into something that might have been a smile, if it had reached his eyes. a dark and dangerous expression that reminded her exactly how much power he wielded and how little she actually had. "You are in no position to demand anything," he said, but his tone lacked heat, almost sounding amused. "But I agree to your terms, because I am not the monster you seem to think I am, despite the evidence you have so carefully catalogued. You will have everything you need to do your work, and when this crisis has passed, we will discuss what comes next between us." There was a promise in those words, a threat wrapped in silk, and Alara felt her pulse quicken with something that was definitely not fear alone. Before she could respond, before she could parse the layers of meaning in his statement, a commotion at the doors drew their attention, as a group of wolves entered carrying stacks of ancient texts and scrolls, their arms loaded with materials from the palace libraries. A tall female with sharp features and intelligent eyes approached the king, bowing low before speaking. "My king, we have brought everything we could find related to the shadow beasts, the veil between worlds, and the ancient sealing rituals. It is not much. Most of the detailed information was lost during the Purge 300 years ago, when the council deemed such knowledge too dangerous for common wolves to possess. We will need the Omega text to fill in the gaps, assuming they still exist." Alara stepped forward, her healer's mind already cataloging what she knew about the forbidden archives hidden deep beneath the sanctuary grounds. "They exist," she confirmed. "The Omegas have kept the old knowledge alive through oral tradition and carefully guarded manuscripts because we knew that one day the darkness might return. The sealing rituals required not just alpha strength, but Omega magic, the kind of power that flows from connection to the living world, rather than dominance over it. Your ancestors understood that balance was necessary, that true strength came from the union of opposing forces, working in harmony. When the council banned Omega magic and relegated us to healing and childbearing, they severed half of the kingdom's true power. If we are to face what is coming, we will need to restore that balance, at least temporarily." Her words fell into the assembled group like stones, because what she was suggesting was heresy, according to the laws that had governed their society for centuries. Omega magic had been banned precisely because it represented a threat to alpha supremacy, i.e., power that could not be controlled through physical dominance or political manipulation. To allow it now would be to admit that the entire structure of their world was built on a lie, that strength alone was insufficient. Kale's expression had gone very still, his eyes calculating as he processed the implications of what she was saying. Around them, the scholar wolves exchanged glances, some fearful, others intrigued, all of them aware that they were standing at a crossroads that would define the future of their kind. The king turned to face Alara fully, his massive frame somehow both threatening and strangely protective, as he studied her with an intensity that made her feel exposed down to her very soul. "You are telling me that to save the kingdom, I must undo the very laws that have kept it stable for 3 centuries, he said slowly. "That I must allow Omega magic to flourish again, must give power back to those who were deliberately stripped of it, because our ancestors feared what they might do with it. Do you understand what you are asking? Do you comprehend the chaos this could unleash?" Alara met his gaze without flinching, letting him see the certainty in her eyes, the absolute conviction that came from years of study and understanding of the old ways. "I am telling you that the stability you speak of is an illusion," she replied. "Your kingdom is held together by fear and force, and the moment a greater threat appears, it begins to crumble because there is no true loyalty, no genuine bonds of trust and cooperation. The shadow beasts are not just monsters from beyond the veil. They are manifestations of imbalance, drawn to worlds where the natural order has been corrupted. They come because we have broken something fundamental, and they will not stop until everything is consumed or the balance is restored." The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket, and Alara saw understanding dawn in Kale's eyes, a terrible comprehension of truths he had perhaps always known, but chosen to ignore. He turned away from her, pacing toward the throne with the restless energy of a caged predator, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. but it carried to every corner of the vast hall. 300 years ago, my ancestor King Aldrich Bloodmoon sealed away the shadow beasts with the help of his mate, Queen Lyria of the Silver Moon. The histories say she died in the ritual, sacrificed herself to complete the sealing because the Omega magic required a life for a life, balance for balance. Aldrich went mad with grief afterward, and in his rage, he blamed the Omega magic for taking her from him. He declared it forbidden, dangerous, a power that demanded too high a price. Every king since has maintained that ban, convinced that we were protecting our people from the same fate. But perhaps we were only protecting ourselves from having to face what using such power truly means. He turned back to face them, and Alara saw something in his expression that shocked her. A vulnerability she would never have believed possible in the fearsome Alpha King. Perhaps we have been cowards, hiding behind laws and traditions because the truth is simply too difficult to bear. The admission hung in the air like a confession, and the scholar wolves looked at each other with wide eyes, unable to believe what they were hearing. Alara felt her heart clench with unexpected sympathy, because she suddenly understood that beneath the cruelty and the tyranny lay a lineage of grief, generations of kings who had built walls of law and violence to protect themselves from the pain their ancestor had endured. It did not excuse the suffering those laws had caused, but it explained the origin of the wound that had festered for centuries. She stepped toward him slowly, aware that every wolf in the room was watching this impossible moment unfold, the Omega healer approaching the king. Not with fear, but with something dangerously close to compassion. Grief makes monsters of us all if we let it, she said softly, but it does not have to define us forever. Your ancestor lost his mate and tried to prevent anyone from experiencing that pain again. But in doing so, he created a different kind of suffering for millions. You have the power to change that now, to choose a different path, not because I ask it of you, but because the kingdom you have spent your life building will not survive if you cling to broken systems simply because they are familiar. Kale's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, the rest of the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them suspended in a bubble of impossible connection. Alara felt that pull again, stronger now, the Omega magic in her blood recognizing something in him that called to it like a song she had been waiting her whole life to hear. It was insane, impossible, completely inappropriate given who they were and the circumstances they found themselves in. But she could not deny what her instincts were screaming at her. This Alpha, this terrible and broken king, was somehow tied to her in ways that defied logic and reason. She saw the moment he felt it too, saw his pupils dilate and his breathing change, his entire body going rigid as if fighting against the same magnetic pull that threatened to drag her toward him. "If you will permit me, my king," one of the scholar wolves interrupted carefully, breaking the spell that had fallen over them. "We are wasting time we do not have. The enemy approaches whether we are ready or not, and philosophical debates about the nature of power will not stop them. Perhaps we should focus on the immediate crisis, and leave the larger questions for when we are not facing extinction." The words were sensible, pragmatic, exactly what the situation demanded. But Alara could have cursed the interruption, because she had been close to something, some understanding that might have changed everything. Kale shook himself slightly, his expression smoothing back into the mask of cold command that he wore so naturally, though she thought she saw regret flicker in his eyes before it disappeared. "You are correct," he said briskly, falling back into the role of warrior king with practiced ease. "We focus on survival first, revolution second. Omega Nightshade, you will work with the scholars to compile everything we know about the sealing rituals and the Omega magic required to perform them. I want options, strategies, backup plans for the backup plans. If using Omega magic is what saves us, then we will use it. Damn the laws and anyone who objects. The rest of you, to your assigned tasks. We have 3 days to prepare for a war our great-grandparents thought they had ended forever. Do not waste a single moment." The room erupted into controlled chaos as wolves scattered to their duties, but Kale caught Alara's arm again before she could move, pulling her aside with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the strength she knew he possessed. "There is something you should know," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "Something I have told no one in the decades since it happened. When I ascended to the throne, I had a mate, a female I loved more than life itself. She was murdered by members of my own council, who feared that her influence was making me soft, making me question the brutal methods that kept the kingdom stable. I hunted down every wolf involved and made them pay in blood and screaming, but it did not bring her back. It did not fill the emptiness she left behind. I became the monster you see before you, because mercy had cost me everything I cared about, because compassion was rewarded with betrayal and loss. So when you speak of choices and humanity, understand that I know exactly what I have sacrificed and why." The raw pain in his words stole Alara's breath, because beneath the confession lay a grief so profound that it had reshaped an entire kingdom in its image. She understood now why he ruled through fear, why he had built walls so high that no one could reach him, why the mention of Omega magic and mate bonds had affected him so deeply. He was not simply cruel by nature, but by deliberate choice. A choice born from trauma so severe that it had broken something fundamental inside him. Her healer's heart ached for the wolf he had been before loss twisted him into the tyrant he became. But she also knew that pain was not an excuse, that suffering did not justify inflicting it upon others. "I am sorry for your loss," she said sincerely. "No one should endure what you have endured. But Kal," and she used his name again deliberately, feeling him flinch slightly at the intimacy of it, "your pain does not give you the right to create that same pain for others. You have spent decades making the entire kingdom pay for the sins of a few, and that is not justice. It is just more trauma spreading like a disease. If you truly loved her, honor her memory by being the wolf she must have seen in you, the one she loved before grief consumed him." His hand tightened on her arm, not painfully but with desperate intensity, as if she were a lifeline and he was drowning. "You speak as if redemption is possible for someone like me," he said hoarsely, "as if the blood on my hands could ever be washed clean. I have done things, Omega, terrible things in the name of order and security. I have executed wolves for crimes they barely committed, torn apart families for the slightest hint of rebellion, created a kingdom where everyone lives in constant fear, because fear was the only language I understood anymore. How does someone come back from that? How do you forgive yourself when you cannot even count all the lives you have destroyed?" The questions were not rhetorical, but genuine. The desperate plea of someone who had lived in darkness so long that he had forgotten what light looked like. Alara felt tears prick at her eyes because beneath the tyrant king stood a broken wolf who had been surviving rather than living, who had locked his heart away so thoroughly that he had forgotten it could still beat. She reached up with her free hand, slowly, carefully, and placed it over his where it gripped her arm, letting him feel the warmth of her touch, the connection that pulsed between them like a living thing. "Redemption is not about forgetting what you have done," she said gently. "It is about choosing to do better from this moment forward. You cannot bring back the wolves you have killed or undo the suffering you have caused, but you can stop adding to it. You can choose mercy over vengeance, compassion over fear, building over destroying. It will not be easy, and it will not erase your past, but it will create a different future, and sometimes that is the only redemption available to us. Start with small choices, like the clemency you granted today, and build from there. Become the king your mate would have been proud to stand beside, even if she is not here to see it." For a long moment, Kyle said nothing, just stood there absorbing her words like a dying man being offered water in a desert. Then, slowly, he released her arm and stepped back, his expression unreadable but his eyes holding something that might have been hope buried under layers of skepticism and fear. "We have work to do," he said finally, his voice rough with emotions he was clearly struggling to contain. "Let us focus on saving the kingdom. And then, if we survive, we can discuss what kind of king I might become. It is all I can offer you right now, Omega. All I can promise without lying to us both." Alara nodded, understanding that some transformations could not be rushed, that healing the deepest wounds took time and patience and consistent effort. She turned toward the scholars who waited with their arms full of texts and scrolls, ready to begin the work that might save them all or might prove futile in the face of ancient darkness. But as she walked away, she felt Kale's eyes on her back, felt the weight of possibility hanging in the air between them, and wondered if fate had brought her to this palace, not just to help save the kingdom, but to save the king himself from the prison of his own making. The hours that followed blurred together in a haze of research and revelation, as Alara and the scholar wolves pored over every scrap of information they could find. The Omega texts that arrived from the sanctuary proved invaluable, filling in gaps that the official histories had deliberately obscured, revealing truths that the council had worked for centuries to bury. The sealing ritual that had banished the shadow beasts 300 years ago had indeed required Omega magic, specifically the power that came from the mate bond between an Alpha and Omega, working in perfect harmony. King Aldrich and Queen Lyria had been true mates, their bond so strong that it created a channel for power greater than either could wield alone. But the ritual had demanded a sacrifice, a price paid in blood and life force that the queen had willingly given. What the histories had not recorded, what Alara discovered in the carefully preserved Omega chronicles, was that Lyria had not actually died in the ritual itself, but had been murdered afterward by the same council members who later convinced Aldrich to ban Omega magic. They had feared that the demonstration of Omega power would inspire others to seek equality, to challenge the hierarchy that kept Alphas in absolute control, so they had eliminated the queen and blamed her death on the magic itself, turning Aldrich's grief into a weapon against his own people. The revelation made Alara's blood run cold, because it meant that everything, the ban on Omega magic, the centuries of oppression, the fundamental imbalance that had weakened the kingdom and allowed the shadow beast to return, all of it stemmed from a lie told by wolves who valued power over truth. She looked up from the text she was reading to find Kale standing in the doorway of the research chamber, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that suggested he had been there for some time. The scholar wolves had dispersed hours ago to catch a few hours of sleep before dawn, leaving her alone with her discoveries and the terrible weight of their implications. "How long have you been standing there?" she asked quietly, setting down the ancient manuscript with careful reverence. "Long. Enough to see you make the connection," he replied, moving into the room with that predatory grace that never quite left him. "Long enough to watch you realize that my entire lineage built itself on a foundation of murder and lies." The scholars found a separate account in the sealed archives, one that confirms what you have just read. My ancestor did not lose his mate to magic but to conspiracy, and in his grief, he became the tool of those who had killed her, helping them cement a system of oppression that has poisoned our society ever since. So you see, Omega, you were more right than you knew when you called me a monster. It runs in my blood, this capacity for destruction disguised as order. Alara rose from her seat and crossed the distance between them, driven by an impulse she did not fully understand but could not resist. She reached up to cup his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes, to see the conviction burning there. "You are not your ancestor," she said firmly. "You did not know the truth until now, and you cannot be held responsible for lies told centuries before you were born. But you know the truth now, Kale, and what you do with that knowledge will define who you truly are. You can continue the cycle, can maintain the lies because they are convenient and familiar, or you can break it, can be the king who finally chooses truth over tradition. The choice is yours, and yours alone." His hands came up to cover hers, his touch gentle despite the strength in his fingers, and Alara felt that connection between them flare to life again, stronger now, more insistent. She knew what it was, had known from the moment their eyes first met in the throne room, but the impossibility of it had kept her from acknowledging the truth. Kale Bloodmoon, the tyrant king everyone feared, was her true mate, the other half of her soul that every Omega dreamed of finding, and most never did. The bond between them was unmistakable now, singing in her blood and magic, like a chorus of recognition, demanding that she acknowledge what fate had decreed. She saw the moment he felt it too, saw his eyes widen and his breath catch, his entire body going rigid with shock and something that might have been fear, or might have been longing so intense it hurt. "It cannot be," he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction, as if he were arguing against something he already knew to be true. "You are my mate. The moon goddess has bound us together across every impossible divide, Omega and Alpha, healer and destroyer, compassion and cruelty. How can this be? What cosmic joke ties you to a wolf like me?" Alara felt tears slip down her cheeks because she had no answer that would make sense. No explanation for why fate would choose to bind her to the one wolf she should despise above all others. But she also felt the rightness of it, the way their energies aligned like puzzle pieces clicking into place, the potential for what they could become together if they were. "Brave enough to try. Maybe it is not a joke but an opportunity," she said softly. "Maybe the universe knew that you needed someone who would see you clearly, who would not bow to your power or fear your rage, who would stand before you and demand that you be better. And maybe I needed someone who would challenge me to believe that even the most broken things can be healed, that redemption is possible for anyone willing to do the work. We are opposites in every way that matters, but perhaps that is precisely the point. Perhaps together we could create the balance that has been missing for so long." Kyle's hands tightened on hers, and she felt the tremor running through him. The war between desire and disbelief, between hope and the weight of everything he had done. "I do not deserve you," he said roughly. "I do not deserve this chance, this gift from the moon goddess. I have done nothing to earn your compassion or your faith, and I fear that if I reach for this, if I allow myself to believe it is real, it will be torn away like everything else I have ever cared about." The vulnerability in his words broke something open in Alara's chest, because beneath the armor of cruelty and control lived a wolf so terrified of loss that he had chosen to feel nothing rather than risk feeling everything. She understood that fear intimately, because she had felt it herself, had built her own walls to protect against the pain of a world that did not value omegas beyond their usefulness. But the mate bond was asking them both to be braver than they had ever been, to step out from behind their defenses and trust in something neither of them could control. "Deserving has nothing to do with it," she said. "I did not choose this any more than you did, but it exists whether we accept it or not. We can ignore it, can pretend the bond does not exist, and go on living our separate lives of quiet desperation. Or we can honor what fate has given us and see where it leads. I am not saying it will be easy or that it will solve all our problems, but I am saying that I feel it too, this pull between us, and I am willing to try if you are." The words hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm, an invitation and a challenge, all at once. Kale searched her face as if looking for deception or manipulation, some trick that would explain away the sincerity he saw there. But Alara let him look, let him see all the way to her soul, where the truth lived naked and undeniable. Then, slowly, hesitantly, like a wolf taking its first steps after a devastating injury, he leaned down and pressed his forehead to hers, a gesture of intimacy and trust that spoke of pack bonds and deep connection. "I will try," he whispered against her skin. "I cannot promise I will not fail, or that I will transform overnight into the wolf you deserve, but I will try to be better, to choose differently, to honor this gift we have been given. For you, Omega. I will try." The moment his words settled between them, Alara felt the mate bond snap into place fully, a connection so profound and complete that it stole her breath and made her knees weak. Power surged through her, Omega magic awakening with a force she had never experienced, responding to the presence of her true alpha, the one wolf in all the world designed to balance and complete her. She gasped as her senses expanded, suddenly aware of Kale's heartbeat matching her own, of the flow of energy between them like a circuit finally closed, of the way her magic and his strength wove together into something greater than either possessed alone. Through the bond, she felt his shock and wonder, felt the walls he had built around his heart beginning to crack and crumble under the onslaught of genuine connection. felt the first tentative stirrings of hope in a soul that had been dead for decades. Cale pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his own silver gaze blazing with emotion so intense it was almost painful to witness. "I feel you," he said in wonder. "Inside me, in my mind and heart and soul. I can feel you like you have always been there, and I just could not see it before. Is this what it is meant to be? A mate bond? Is this the power our ancestors wielded before fear and lies corrupted everything?" Elara nodded, tears streaming freely now because the beauty of what they had just experienced was almost too much to bear after a lifetime of isolation and loneliness. "Yes," she breathed. "This is what was lost when Omega magic was banned, when the bonds between Alpha and Omega were reduced to mere biology instead of the sacred connection they were always meant to be. This is what we can use to save the kingdom, Kyle. This power that flows between us. Together we can perform the sealing ritual, can send the shadow beasts back beyond the veil and restore the balance that has been broken. But it will require trust, complete and absolute trust in each other, because the magic demands honesty and the willingness to be vulnerable in ways neither of us have allowed ourselves to be in a very long time." Before Cale could respond, a commotion outside the research chamber drew their attention, as running feet and urgent voices shattered the intimate moment. The beta burst through the door, his face pale and his eyes wide with alarm, barely remembering to bow before delivering his message. "My king, the enemy has arrived ahead of schedule. They are at the outer walls now, thousands strong, and they have brought siege weapons and dark magic we cannot counter. The city is in chaos, refugees flooding toward the palace, and our warriors are barely holding the first defensive line. We need you, my king. We need orders, and we need them now." Cale's expression shifted instantly from vulnerable mate to commanding war leader, the transformation so complete that Elara might have doubted what had just passed between them, if not for the bond still singing in her blood. He released her hands and turned toward the beta, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone born to lead in crisis. "Sound the recall. Bring everyone behind the inner walls and seal the gates. I want every able-bodied wolf armed and positioned according to the siege protocols. Evacuate the civilians to the palace lower levels and post guards at every entrance. And bring me my armor and weapons. We hold the line here, or we do not hold it at all." The beta saluted and disappeared to carry out the orders, leaving Cale and Elara alone for one more brief moment. The king turned back to her, and she saw the conflict in his eyes, the war between his duty to lead the defense and his newly awakened instinct to protect his mate above all else. "You will stay in the palace," he said, and it was not quite in order, but close. "You will be safe here while I lead the defense against the shadow beasts. When the battle is won, we will complete the sealing ritual together. But I cannot do what needs to be done if I am worrying about your safety on the battlefield." Elara felt her own instincts rebel against the command, because Omegas were not meant to hide while others fought. They were meant to be part of the battle in their own way, wielding the magic that balanced destruction with creation. She stepped forward, placing her hand over his heart, feeling the bond pulse between them with insistent urgency. "I understand your need to protect me," she said carefully, "but the sealing ritual requires preparation, requires that we establish the channels through which the magic will flow when the moment comes. If you go into battle without that foundation, we will not be strong enough when it matters most. Let me come with you, not to fight, but to weave the Omega magic around you, to begin building the network of power we will need. I promise I will stay behind the lines, will not put myself in unnecessary danger, but please do not shut me out of this. We are stronger together, Kyle. That is the entire point of the mate bond." She watched him struggle with the request, saw his alpha instincts warring with the logic of her argument and the pull of the bond that demanded they stay close. Finally, he nodded slowly, though reluctance was written in every line of his body. "You may come," he said, "but you will have an escort of my most trusted guards, and at the first sign of danger, they will remove you from the battlefield whether you like it or not. This is not negotiable, Omega, because I have just found you, and I will not lose you to the same darkness that nearly destroyed my ancestor. Promise me you will not take risks, that you will value your life even if you have never valued mine." The raw honesty in his words, the admission that he feared losing her before they had even begun, made Alara's heart clench with emotions she was not ready to name. She raised herself on her toes and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek, feeling him freeze at the unexpected tenderness. "I promise," she whispered. "Now let us go save your kingdom, my king, so that afterward we can discuss what kind of kingdom it will become." Together they moved toward the door, toward the battle that awaited and the destiny that called. Two halves of a whole that had been separated for far too long, finally united against the darkness that threatened to consume everything they held dear. The courtyard of the Blood Moon Palace had transformed into organized chaos as warriors assembled in precise formations, their armor gleaming in the pre-dawn light, their faces set with grim determination. Alara stood beside Kale on the raised platform overlooking the gathered forces, her healer's robes replaced with practical leathers that the king's servants had found for her, though she had insisted on keeping the green sash that marked her as a sanctuary Omega. Through the bond, she could feel Kale's focus sharpening, his strategic mind already 3 steps ahead, calculating angles and probabilities, weaknesses and strengths. The connection between them allowed her to see the battlefield through his eyes, to understand the complex dance of war in ways her peaceful upbringing had never prepared her for, but also to lend him her perspective, her ability to see patterns in the chaos that his warrior's mind might miss. When he began issuing orders, his voice carrying across the courtyard with commanding presence, she wove threads of Omega magic around his words, subtle enchantments that would bolster the courage of his warriors and strengthen the bonds of pack loyalty that held them together. The Scholar Wolves had worked through the night to prepare the initial components of the sealing ritual, creating focus points at strategic locations around the city, where Alara would later channel the Omega magic needed to complete the binding. But first, they had to survive the assault, had to hold the shadow beasts at bay, long enough to gather the power required. As Kyle finished his final instructions, and the warriors began moving toward their assigned positions, he turned to Alara with an expression that was part concern and part fierce protectiveness. "Stay close to the command center," he said quietly. "Captain Thorne and his unit will guard you with their lives. But if things go badly, if the defenses collapse, I need you to promise me you will run. Take the escape tunnels beneath the palace and flee to the sanctuary lands. They may be the only place the shadow beasts cannot reach, and the kingdom will need you to survive even if I do not." Alara wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that she would not abandon him to face the darkness alone. But the look in his eyes stopped her. This was not the tyrant issuing commands, but her mate expressing the depth of his care in the only way he knew how, through ensuring her survival above all else. "I will not run unless there is no other choice," she compromised. "But Kale, you need to trust that I can do my part in this battle. Omega magic is not about destruction, but it can shield and heal and strengthen in ways that alpha power cannot. Let me support you as I was meant to, and together we will be unstoppable." He pulled her close for one brief moment, his arms coming around her in an embrace that spoke of desperation and hope tangled together. "Then be careful, my heart," he murmured against her hair. "Be brave and clever and survive, because I have only just found the reason to become the king I was always meant to be, and I refuse to lose." That before I have even begun, before she could respond, the sound of horns blaring across the city shattered the moment, signaling that the enemy had breached the outer defenses and was advancing toward the inner walls. Kyle released her and turned toward the palace gates, his entire bearing shifting into the warrior king who had defended this kingdom for decades. But now, there was something different in his stance, something that had not been there before. He fought not just for power or control, but for something worth protecting, for a future that might actually be different from the blood-soaked past. If you love this story, remember to like this video and share it with fellow fans of supernatural romance. Drop a comment below, telling me which moment touched your heart the most. Now let's see how our Alpha King faces the darkness threatening his kingdom. The battle that erupted across the city was unlike anything Alara had ever witnessed or imagined in her most terrible Nightmares. The shadow beasts were exactly as the ancient text described, creatures of pure malice and hunger that seemed to absorb light itself, their forms shifting and changing. Never quite solid, never quite real. They moved through the streets like living darkness, their claws and teeth rending flesh and stone with equal ease, their presence poisoning the very air with a cold that burned worse than fire. The warriors of the Blood Moon Pack fought with incredible courage and skill. But for every shadow beast they managed to banish, 2 more seemed to take its place, pouring through tears and reality itself that the dark magic had created. From her position in the command center, Alara could see the defensive lines beginning to buckle under the relentless assault, could hear the screams of wounded wolves being carried to the makeshift healing stations, could feel through the bond the strain on Kale as he fought at the front lines, his alpha power blazing like a beacon against the encroaching darkness. She closed her eyes and reached deep into the well of Omega magic that the mate bond had fully awakened, drawing on power she had only theorized about in her studies, but never actually wielded. The energy responded to her call like a living thing, eager and wild and ancient beyond measure, the accumulated magic of countless generations of Omegas who had been silenced but never truly gone. Alara began to weave that power into a network of protection, creating shields of shimmering light that settled over the warriors like invisible armor, healing enchantments that closed wounds almost as quickly as they were inflicted, and bonds of strength that connected each fighter to their packmates, multiplying their effectiveness through shared purpose. Through the bond, she felt Kale's surprise and gratitude as the Omega magic bolstered his forces, felt his understanding dawn that this was what had been missing, the balance between destruction and creation, between the Alpha's strength and the Omega's nurturing power. Together, even separated by the chaos of battle, they were beginning to turn the tide, to push back against the darkness that had seemed unstoppable only moments before. But the leader of the Shadow Beast army was no mere creature of mindless hunger. Through the swirling combat, Alara caught sight of the female the scouts had described, a wolf who radiated malice and madness in equal measure, her eyes burning with hellfire as she directed her forces with terrifying intelligence. The female was ancient, that much was clear, her power carrying the weight of centuries, and when her gaze locked onto the command center where Alara stood, recognition flashed across her twisted features. So the Blood Moon line has finally found another mate. The female's voice carried across the battlefield, amplified by dark magic until every wolf could hear. How poetic that history should repeat itself, that another Omega should stand beside the tyrant. King, ready to sacrifice everything for a kingdom that has never valued her kind. Tell me, little healer, do you know what happened to the last queen? Do you know the truth of how she died? Alara felt ice flood her veins because the female was speaking directly to her, targeting her specifically. And through the bond, she felt Kyle's fury and fear spike as he realized the danger. The female continued, her words designed to sow doubt and discord among the defenders. Queen Lyria did not die in the sealing ritual as the histories claim. She was murdered by the wolves she trusted, betrayed by the very system she had tried to change. And when the shadow beasts return, as we always do when the balance is broken, we come not as invaders, but as instruments of cosmic justice, punishing worlds that have strayed too far from the natural order. The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled warriors, because many had not known the truth that Alara and Kale had discovered only hours before. The poor female pressed her advantage, her words like poison seeping into hearts already strained by fear and exhaustion. Your Alpha King is the latest in a line of tyrants who have built their power on lies and oppression. Why do you fight for him? Why do you die defending a system that values only strength and dominates all else? Join us, embrace the darkness, and we will show you a world where power is shared equally, where no one wolf stands above the rest. It was a seductive lie wrapped in just enough truth to be dangerous, and Alara saw some of the warriors hesitate, saw doubt creep into their eyes as they questioned everything they had been taught. She knew she had to counter the female's words, had to give the defenders something to believe in beyond fear and tradition. or the battle would be lost not through superior force, but through the erosion of will. Drawing on every ounce of courage she possessed, Alara stepped to the edge of the command center platform, her voice amplified by the same Omega magic that had been shielding the warriors, ensuring every wolf on the battlefield could hear her words. "You speak of justice and balance," Alara called out, her voice clear and strong despite the chaos surrounding them. "But you offer only a different form of tyranny. Darkness instead of light. Chaos instead of order. True balance does not come from destroying one system and replacing it with another equally broken. It comes from transformation, from choosing to build something better from the ashes of what failed. Yes, the Blood Moon line has committed terrible wrongs, has created a kingdom built on fear and oppression. But that does not mean every wolf here is complicit in those sins. These warriors fight not for a tyrant, but for their families, their packs, their homes, and the hope that tomorrow might be different from yesterday. And I stand here not as a victim sacrificing herself, but as a mate choosing to fight alongside my alpha for a future where Omega magic and alpha strength work in harmony instead of opposition." The words rang across the battlefield like a bell, and Alara felt the tide shift, felt the warriors find their resolve again as they chose to believe in possibility rather than surrender to despair. Through the bond, she felt Kael's love and pride surge toward her, his own power amplifying in response to her declaration, and together they created a pulse of combined energy that rolled across the battlefield like a wave, driving back the shadow beasts and their dark magic. But the female leader was not finished, her rage at being countered manifesting as a surge of dark power that tore through reality itself, creating a massive rift between worlds that threatened to swallow entire city blocks. "Pretty words from a naive child," the female snarled. "You think love and hope are enough to change what has been broken for centuries? You think one moment of unity can undo generations of corruption? Let me show you the true cost of your optimism." She gestured toward the rift, and from its depths poured shadow beasts in numbers that dwarfed everything that had come before, a tide of darkness that would overwhelm even the most stalwart defense. Alara felt her heart sink as she realized they could not win this through conventional battle, could not simply fight until the enemy was defeated because the enemy was infinite, drawn from the realm of shadow itself, where numbers meant nothing. The only way to end this was to complete the sealing ritual now, in the midst of combat, without the careful preparation they had planned. She reached through the bond to Kael, her thoughts clear and urgent. "We have to do it now," she told him. "The sealing ritual, we cannot wait, or there will be nothing left to save. I know we are not ready. I know it is dangerous, but it is the only way." Through the bond, she felt his immediate understanding and his equally immediate resistance. "The ritual requires both of us at the focal point," he sent back. "If I leave the front lines, the defense will collapse before we can complete the sealing. There has to be another way." But Alara had been studying the ancient texts all night, had absorbed the knowledge of Omega magic that her predecessors had preserved through the centuries of prohibition, and she knew there was no other way. The sealing worked because Alpha and Omega together created a perfect circuit of power, strength flowing out to bind the darkness while compassion pulled in to heal. The tears in reality, force and gentleness working in concert to restore balance. Without both elements present and actively engaged, the ritual would fail, and the shadow beasts would consume their world completely. "Trust me," she sent through the bond, pouring every ounce of certainty and love she possessed into the words. "Trust that I know what I am doing, and that together we are strong enough. Come to me now, my king, my mate, my heart, and let us save this kingdom, so we can remake it into something worthy of the sacrifice." She felt the moment Kael made his decision, felt him break away from the front lines, and begin fighting his way toward the command center where she stood. The warriors around him redoubled their efforts, understanding without being told that their king was attempting something desperate and necessary, buying him the time and space he needed with their own blood and courage. Alara began the ritual even before he reached her, her voice rising in the ancient words. that had been passed down through generations of Omega magic users, words in a language older than the kingdom itself. Older, perhaps, than wolves had walked on two legs and built cities. The air around her began to shimmer and pulse with power, reality bending in response to her call, and she felt the focus points she had prepared throughout the city activate in sequence, creating a network of light that matched the web of darkness the shadow beasts had spread. When Kyle finally reached the platform and took her hands in his, the circuit completed with a surge of power so intense that it knocked nearby wolves off their feet, alpha strength and omega magic combining into something that transcended both. Together they spoke the words of binding, their voices merging into a single resonant tone that carried across the battlefield and beyond, reaching into the spaces between worlds where the shadow beasts originated. Alara felt the magic flow through her like a river, felt Kale's strength providing the foundation, while her compassion shaped and directed the energy, felt the bond between them stretch and strain under the immense forces they were channeling. The ritual demanded everything they had, and then demanded more, required them to open themselves completely to each other, to merge not just their power, but their very souls in a union so intimate that all barriers between them dissolved. Through the bond, Alara experienced Kale's memories as if they were her own, felt the weight of every life he had taken, every cruel decision he had made, every moment of loneliness and grief that had shaped him into the tyrant he became. The darkness in his past threatened to overwhelm her, but she did not pull away, did not judge or condemn, only accepted it all as part of who he was, while showing him through the connection that who he had been did not have to define who he would become. In return, she felt him absorb her memories, her pain at being dismissed and undervalued, her exhaustion from trying to heal wounds in a system designed to create them, her loneliness as an Omega, without a mate in a world that saw her only as a tool for breeding or a servant for caring. But he also felt her hope, her unshakable belief in the possibility of change, her compassion that extended even to those who least deserved it. And through her eyes, he began to see himself not as the monster he believed himself to be, but as a wolf capable of redemption if he was brave enough to reach for it. The sealing magic built to a crescendo as their merged consciousness reached out across the city, across the kingdom, across the very fabric of reality itself, finding the tears that the shadow beasts had created and beginning to mend them. It was like weaving on a cosmic scale, threads of light and strength interlacing to create a barrier between worlds, a wall that would hold back the darkness and restore the balance that had been broken. But the female leader of the shadow beasts was not surrendering without a fight, her power surging as she attempted to counter the ritual, to tear down what they were building even as it took shape. "You cannot seal us away forever," she shrieked, her voice distorted by rage and dark magic. "We are the consequence of your corruption, the price of your broken world. We will always find a way back, as long as the imbalance persists. Kill us today, and we will return in a generation or a century or a millennium, again and again, until you finally learn the lesson, or until we consume everything." Her words carried terrible truth, because sealing the shadow beasts did not address the underlying problem, did not fix the broken system that had weakened the kingdom and allowed the darkness to return in the first place. Through the bond, Alara felt Kale's understanding dawn, felt him realize that the ritual alone was not enough, that they needed to offer something more, a promise and a commitment that would demonstrate real change. Without breaking the flow of magic, he raised his voice so that every wolf on the battlefield could hear, his words carrying the weight of absolute command, but also something new, something that might have been humility, or might have been hope. "Hear me, warriors of the Blood Moon Kingdom," he called out. "The darkness speaks truth when it says we have broken the natural order, when it claims our corruption invited this destruction. For too long, I have ruled through fear and violence, have valued strength above all else, and crushed any who dared suggest a different way. But today I make a new choice. Today I declare before the moon goddess and every witness here that if we survive this battle, the kingdom will change. Omega magic will be restored to its rightful place. The tribute system will be abolished. The cruel laws that created suffering will be reformed. And I will rule not as a tyrant, but as a servant of the pack, alongside my mate, who will share power equally. This I swear on my life and soul, on the bond that connects me to Alara Nightshade, and on the memory of Queen Lyria, who was murdered for trying to create the very changes I now promise to make. The declaration sent shockwaves through the assembled wolves, but Alara felt through the bond that Kale meant every word, that this was not manipulation or strategy, but genuine commitment born from transformation. The Omega magic responded to his oath, surging with renewed strength, as if the universe itself approved of his promise, and the sealing barrier they were building solidified, becoming stronger and more permanent with each passing moment. The shadow beasts began to scream as they were pulled back toward the rifts, dragged away from the physical world by the combined force of alpha strength and omega compassion working in perfect harmony, their resistance crumbling against the power of a mate, bond fully realized and properly wielded. The female leader made one last desperate attempt to break free, hurling herself at the barrier with all her considerable power. But Kale and Alara stood firm, their merged will unshakable, their combined magic burning like a sun against the darkness. As the female struck the barrier, Alara reached out with her Omega magic and did something unexpected, something the ritual had not called for, but her compassion demanded. Instead of simply pushing the female back, she touched the corrupted wolf's mind with healing energy, offering not destruction, but the possibility of peace, of release from the rage and pain that had consumed her for so long. For just a moment, the female's hellfire eyes cleared, and Alara saw not a monster, but a wolf who had been broken by the same systems that had broken so many others. A victim of injustice who had become an instrument of vengeance because no other path had been available. "Thank you," the female whispered, her voice suddenly clear and heartbreakingly young. "For seeing me, for offering what no one else ever did. Perhaps your king will actually keep his promises. Perhaps things will finally change. If so, we will not return. The balance will hold. But if he fails, if the old ways persist, know that we are always waiting, always watching, ready to remind your world of the price of corruption." Then, the female and all her shadow beasts were pulled through the rifts, and the tears in reality sealed shut with a sound like worlds colliding, the magic locking into place with finality that resonated through every living thing for miles. The sudden silence that fell across the battlefield was almost shocking after hours of screaming and combat, broken only by the gasping breaths of exhausted warriors and the moans of the wounded. Slowly, carefully, Alara and Kale released their grip on the massive forces they had been channeling, letting the Omega magic settle back into dormancy while the alpha power returned to sustainable levels. The moment the ritual completely ended, Kale's knees buckled, and he would have fallen if Alara had not caught him, supporting his weight as best she could despite her own exhaustion. Around them, the warriors began to cheer, their voices rising in celebration of survival and victory, but Alara barely heard them, because all her attention was focused on her mate, who had given everything he had to save the kingdom. She eased him down onto the platform, cradling his head in her lap, checking him over with her healer's senses to ensure the magic had not damaged him beyond her ability to mend. Through the bond, she felt his consciousness flickering, stretched thin by the demands of the ritual. But underneath the exhaustion lay something peaceful, something she had never sensed in him before. He was not fighting anymore, not struggling against the weight of his past or the expectations of his role, just existing in a moment of quiet contentment, knowing he had done something right, something good, something that honored the memory of his lost mate and the promise of his found one. Alara bent over him, her tears falling onto his face as she poured healing energy into his battered body, whispering words of encouragement and love that she had never thought she would speak to the fearsome Alpha King. "Stay with me," she pleaded. "You made promises today, Kale Bloodmoon, and I will hold you to every single one of them. You do not get to make grand declarations about changing the kingdom and then leave me to do all the work alone. Wake up, my king, my mate, my stubborn, impossible, infuriating alpha, and let us begin building the world you swore to create." His eyes fluttered open at her words, silver meeting amber, and the smile that curved his lips was genuine and unguarded in a way she suspected few had ever witnessed. "I am not going anywhere," he murmured, his voice rough but steady. "I have spent too many years alone, too many decades running from anything that might make me feel alive. I am done running, Alara, done hiding behind cruelty and distance. If you will have me, if you can forgive what I have been and help me become what I should be, then I am yours for however long the moon goddess grants us." The declaration was quiet, private, meant only for her ears, but it carried more weight than all his grand pronouncements to the assembled warriors. This was not the king speaking, but the wolf, the male who had finally found something worth more than power or control, worth more even than survival. Alara leaned down and kissed him softly, tasting salt from her tears and smoke from the battle, sealing the promise between them with a tenderness that felt sacred despite the chaos surrounding them. When she pulled back, she saw wonder in his eyes, as if he still could not quite believe this was real, that she was real, that he was allowed to have this after everything he had done. "You are mine," she confirmed, her voice fierce with possessive certainty. "And I am yours, and together we are going to drive the council, absolutely insane with all the changes we are going to make. But first, we need to tend to the wounded and secure the city and probably deal with at least a dozen political challenges from wolves who are not going to appreciate your promises of reform." Kale laughed, the sound startling her because she had never heard him make that sound before. Genuine amusement, without edges of cruelty or mockery. "Let them challenge," he said, allowing her to help him to his feet. "I have faced down shadow beasts and survived. I think I can handle some disgruntled counselors. Besides, I have you now, and you terrify me far more than any political opponent ever could." The admission made Alara laugh in turn, the sound bubbling up from somewhere deep in her chest, releasing tension and fear and exhaustion all at once. Around them, the warriors had begun organizing into recovery teams, moving with the practiced efficiency of wolves who had survived impossible odds, and now faced the equally daunting task of cleaning up the aftermath. Alara spotted Captain Thorne approaching, his armor dented and splattered with blood, but his eyes bright with relief at seeing both his king and the Omega alive and standing. "My king," the captain said, bowing low. "The city is secure. The shadow beasts have been vanquished, and the casualties, while significant, are far less than we feared. The Omega magic you wielded through the bond," he turned to Alara with something like awe in his expression. "It saved hundreds of lives that would otherwise have been lost. The healers are calling it a miracle, and the warriors are already composing songs about the mate bond that saved the kingdom." Alara felt her cheeks heat at the praise because she had not been thinking about miracles or songs, only about keeping as many wolves alive as possible while completing the ritual. But Kale's hand found hers, his fingers interlacing with her own, and through the bond, she felt his pride and gratitude. She did far more than save lives, Kale said quietly. "She saved me, saved us all from a future that would have only led to more suffering and darkness. Make sure that message spreads, Captain. Let every wolf know that the changes I promised today were not empty words spoken in desperation, but genuine commitments I intend to honor. The kingdom will transform, starting now, starting with opening the healing stations to everyone regardless of status, distributing food from the royal stores to those who lost homes in the battle, and convening a council that includes Omega representatives for the first time in 3 centuries. Captain Thorne's eyes widened at the flood of orders, each one representing a fundamental shift in how the kingdom operated, but he saluted sharply and moved to carry out the commands without question or hesitation. When he had gone, Alara turned to Kyle with raised eyebrows. "You are moving quickly," she observed. "I thought we would need to plan, to strategize about how to implement changes, without triggering a rebellion from those invested in the old system. Kale's expression turned serious, his eyes reflecting hard-won wisdom and determination. "I have learned that hesitation is the enemy of transformation," he said. "If we wait, if we give the old powers time to organize and resist, the moment will be lost, and we will be right back where we started. No, better to strike while the kingdom is still reeling from the battle, while everyone remembers how close we came to annihilation, and how the Omega magic they have been taught to fear actually saved them all. We use this momentum to drive change through before the shock wears off, and the familiar patterns reassert themselves. It is ruthless, perhaps, but I am still my father's son in some ways, still willing to use whatever tools are necessary to achieve important goals. The only difference now is that the goals have changed from maintaining control to creating justice." Alara studied him for a long moment, seeing both the tyrant he had been and the king he was becoming existing in uneasy balance, and she understood that transformation was not instant, but a process that would take time and effort and constant vigilance. But she also saw his sincerity, his genuine desire to be better, and that was enough to build on. "Then let us begin," she said. "Show me these counselors who need convincing. Introduce me to the wolves who will resist change, and together we will remind them that the old ways nearly destroyed everything, and that survival demands evolution." The days and weeks that followed the battle were a whirlwind of activity, as Alara and Kyle worked to reshape the kingdom from the inside out. The council chambers, which had once been the exclusive domain of alpha males wielding power through intimidation and tradition, suddenly found themselves invaded by Omega representatives, female voices, and perspectives that challenged every assumption the old guard held dear. Predictably, there was resistance, wolves who sputtered about the impropriety of allowing Omegas into political discussions, who claimed that centuries of tradition could not be overturned simply because the king had found his mate, who warned that change would lead to chaos and the collapse of everything they had built. But Kale faced each challenge with patient firmness, his authority no longer derived from fear alone, but from the respect he was earning through visible commitment to his promises. When a particularly stubborn counselor suggested that the Omega magic should be restricted again now that the crisis had passed, Kyle's response was swift and cutting. "The Omega magic saved your life and the lives of everyone you claim to represent," he said coldly. "If you cannot see the value in that, if you cannot understand that we were weakened by its absence and strengthened by its return, then perhaps you are not fit to serve on a council tasked with guiding the kingdom into a new era. You may step down now, with dignity, or be removed for incompetence. The choice is yours." The counselor chose to step down, and his replacement, nominated by Alara from among the Sanctuary Omegas, was a brilliant strategist who immediately began identifying inefficiencies in the tribute system and proposing reforms that would strengthen the outer territories without weakening the center. It was exactly the kind of fresh perspective the kingdom needed, and even the most resistant counselors could not argue with results. When the changes began producing measurable improvements in pack loyalty and economic stability, Alara found herself dividing her time between the council chambers and the healing stations, using her knowledge of Omega magic to train a new generation of healers, while also ensuring that the political changes were actually benefiting the wolves they were meant to help. She discovered a talent for diplomacy she had not known she possessed, an ability to bridge the gap between the Sanctuary Omegas, who distrusted authority, and the alpha-dominated power structure that had oppressed them for so long. Through patience and persistence, she began weaving connections that transformed isolated groups into a functioning network, creating the foundation for a society where strength and compassion worked in partnership rather than opposition. And through it all, the bond with Kyle deepened and strengthened, their connection becoming the anchor that kept them both grounded when the challenges threatened to overwhelm. Late one night, several months after the battle, Alara found Kyle standing on the balcony of their shared chambers, staring out over the city that gleamed with lights marking homes and businesses rebuilt after the Shadow Beast attack. She approached quietly, wrapping her arms around him from behind, feeling him relax into her embrace with the trust that had become second nature between them. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly, resting her cheek against his. Broad back. He covered her hands with his own, his voice thoughtful when he finally spoke. I am thinking about how different everything looks from up here now, he said. The same city, the same streets, but I see it through different eyes. Through our bond, through the connection to the pack that I had deliberately severed for so long. I can feel their emotions now, their hopes and fears and dreams, and it is overwhelming and beautiful and terrifying all at once. I spent decades convincing myself that distance was necessary for effective rule, that caring too much would make me weak. But I was wrong, Alara. So profoundly wrong. The strength I feel now, the certainty that comes from knowing I am building something worth protecting, rather than just maintaining power for its own sake, it is greater than anything I achieved through fear and violence. Alara tightened her arms around him, her heart swelling with love for this complex, contradictory wolf who had traveled such a long journey, from tyrant to partner. You are doing well, she said gently. The changes are taking root. The kingdom is healing, and the wolves are beginning to believe that a different future is possible. But I know it is hard, Kale. I know that confronting everything you did before and trying to make amends weighs heavily on you. Please remember that redemption is not about being perfect, but about consistently choosing better. And you are doing that every single day. He turned in her arms, pulling her close, burying his face in her hair, as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had shifted beneath his feet. I do not deserve you, he murmured, the words muffled against her. I do not deserve this second chance, or the grace you show me every time I stumble. But I am so grateful, Alara, so grateful that fate brought you to my throne room that day, that you were brave enough to call me by my name and see past the monster to the wolf underneath. You saved me in every way a person can. Be saved, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that gift. Alara pulled back just enough to cup his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes so he could see the absolute truth in her gaze. You are already worthy, she said firmly, not because you are perfect, or because you have erased your past, but because you acknowledge it, because you work every day to create something better, because you allow yourself to be vulnerable and changed by the connection between us. That is all any of us can do, Kale. Admit our mistakes, make amends where possible, and commit to doing better going forward. The moon goddess brought us together not because we were perfect, but because together we could become more than we were apart. And I see that happening every single day. So stop questioning whether you deserve happiness, and just accept it, embrace it. Let it fuel your continued transformation into the king this kingdom actually needs. Her words broke something open, in him, and she felt through the bond the moment he finally allowed himself to believe, to accept that redemption was not something he had to earn through suffering, but something he could claim through choice and action. He kissed her then, pouring everything he felt into the connection, gratitude and love and fierce devotion all tangled together, and she kissed him back with equal intensity, celebrating the miracle of their bond and the future they were building together. When they finally broke, apart, both breathing hard, Kale rested his forehead against hers in that gesture of intimacy that had become their private language. Thank you, he whispered, for everything, for believing in me when no one else did, for standing beside me through all of this chaos, for being my mate and my conscience and my greatest supporter, all at once. Months continued to pass, and the kingdom transformed in ways that would have been unthinkable before the Shadow Beast attack. The tribute system was, completely overhauled, replaced with a cooperative network where each territory contributed according to their abilities and received support according to their needs. The Sanctuary Omegas emerged from isolation, their magic and knowledge becoming integral to everything, from healing to agriculture, to the development of new technologies that blended traditional alpha strength with Omega innovation. The council expanded to include representatives from every segment of society, ensuring that decisions reflected the needs of all wolves rather than just the powerful few. Crime decreased as desperation decreased, loyalty strengthened as trust replaced fear, and for the first time in centuries, wolves began speaking about the future with hope, rather than resignation. There were setbacks, of course. Moments when old prejudices flared, or when the changes moved too quickly for some to adapt. But Alara and Kale faced each challenge as partners, their bond allowing them to present a united front that proved impossible to break. And through it all, their love deepened into something that transcended mere attraction, or even the mystical pull of the mate bond, becoming instead a genuine partnership built on respect and shared values, and the daily choice to prioritize each other's well-being. The day Alara discovered she was pregnant, she had been reviewing proposed changes to the education system with a group of teachers when a wave of dizziness forced her to sit down abruptly. The older Omega healer who was consulting on the project took one look at her and smiled knowingly, ushering the others out before sitting beside Alara with gentle concern. "How long have you been feeling unwell, child?" the healer asked kindly. "A few days," Alara admitted. "I thought it was just exhaustion from all the changes, but this feels different, and through the bond, I can sense that Kale has been worried even though he has not said anything." The healer laughed softly and took Alara's hand, pressing gently against the pulse point at her wrist. "You are carrying a cub," she said with certainty. "Your body knows even if your mind has not caught up yet. Congratulations, Luna Alara. The kingdom will have an heir who represents the new balance between Alpha and Omega, a symbol of the future you and the king have been building." The news stole Alara's breath because she had been so focused on political change and social reform that she had not considered the personal implications of her bond with Kyle, had not thought about children or the legacy they would leave behind. But as the shock faded, joy rushed in to replace it, fierce and overwhelming, because this child would grow up in a kingdom that valued Omega magic, that understood the importance of balance, that believed in compassion as much as strength. She found Kale in the training yards, working with young warriors on technique and strategy, his teaching style so different from the brutal conditioning of his earlier reign that it still sometimes startled her. He sensed her approach through the bond and turned immediately, his expression shifting to concern when he caught the swirl of emotions she was broadcasting. "What is wrong?" he asked, crossing the distance between them in quick strides. "Is everything all right?" Alara could not help the smile that broke across her face, joy bubbling up from deep inside her chest. "Everything is perfect," she said, taking his hands in hers. "Kale, I am pregnant. We are going to have a cub." The words hung between them for a heartbeat as he processed what she had said, and then his face transformed, wonder and disbelief and pure happiness chasing across his features in rapid succession. He let out a whoop of joy that startled every wolf within hearing distance, then swept her up in his arms, spinning her around with careful exuberance before setting her down gently, as if she had suddenly become made of glass. "A cub," he breathed, his hands moving to rest against her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a cub, a child who will grow up knowing love and balance, who will never have to choose between strength and compassion, because they will understand that both are essential. Oh, Alara, my heart, thank you. Thank you for this gift, for everything you have given me." The announcement of the pregnancy was met with celebration throughout the kingdom, wolves gathering in the streets to toast the coming heir and the continued transformation of their society. But for Alara and Kale, the most meaningful moment came later that night, when they stood together in the royal nursery that had been unused for decades, planning how to prepare it for their child. As they discussed colors and furnishings, making decisions together with easy partnership, Alara felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. She thought about the frightened Omega who had walked into the throne room months ago, determined to speak truth to power regardless of the cost, and marveled at how much had changed, how much they had both grown and healed through their connection. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "our child will ask questions someday about how we met, about what the kingdom was like before the changes. How will we explain it? Will we tell them about the tyrant king and the Omega who challenged him?" Kale pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her from behind as they looked out over the nursery that would soon hold their child. "We will tell them the truth," he said quietly. "All of it, the good and the bad, the mistakes I made, and the courage you showed, the darkness we faced and the light we created together. We will teach them that people are not defined by their worst moments but by their willingness to change, and that true strength comes from acknowledging weakness and working to overcome it. If you enjoyed this journey of love and redemption, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story. Hit that notification bell and let me know in the comments what other supernatural romance tales you would like to see. Your support means everything. Now let's see the beautiful conclusion of Kale and Alara's story. The years that followed were marked by continued growth and change, both for the kingdom and for the royal family that had come to symbolize its transformation. The child born from the bond between Alara and Kale, a daughter they named Lyria, in honor of the queen whose sacrifice had been forgotten for too long, grew up surrounded by love and the understanding that power was a responsibility rather than a privilege. She learned alpha strength from her father and omega magic from her mother, becoming living proof that the two forces could coexist in perfect balance within a single individual. The kingdom thrived under the new system, its prosperity and stability attracting wolves from neighboring territories who sought to emulate the changes, and slowly, carefully, the transformation that had begun in the Blood Moon Pack spread outward, touching other communities and inspiring them to examine their own traditions and structures. Alara and Kale ruled together, true partners in every sense, their bond serving as the foundation for everything they built. And though challenges continued to arise, they faced them with the confidence that came from knowing they were stronger together than they had ever been apart. On the anniversary of the battle that had changed everything, the kingdom held a celebration that honored not just the victory over the shadow beasts, but the transformation that victory had sparked. Wolves gathered in the palace courtyard, where Alara and Kale stood on the platform that had once been used for judgments and executions, but now served as a stage for unity and hope. The king addressed the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the authority of his position, but also the warmth of genuine connection to his people. 10 years ago today, he said, "We faced annihilation from an enemy we had invited through our own corruption and imbalance. We survived not through superior force, but through the rediscovery of truths our ancestors knew and our more recent history had forgotten, that strength and compassion must work in harmony, that alpha and omega are not opposed but complementary, that true power comes from connection rather than domination. My mate, Alara, showed me these truths when she dared to see the wolf beneath the crown. When she called me by my name and refused to accept that cruelty was inevitable or that change was impossible. Everything we have built since that day, every reform and innovation and improvement, stems from her courage and the bond we share. So today we celebrate not just survival but transformation, not just the end of darkness, but the beginning of light." Alara stepped forward to stand beside him, their daughter between them, 3 generations of change embodied in their small family unit. She added her own words to Kale's, her voice clear and strong. "We also remember those who were lost, both in the battle and in the centuries of oppression that preceded it. We honor their sacrifice by continuing to build a kingdom where every wolf is valued, where power is shared, where the mistakes of the past inform but do not define our future. The work of transformation is never complete because each generation faces new challenges and must choose how to respond. But if we hold fast to the principles of balance and compassion, if we remember that our strength lies in our connections to each other rather than our dominance over each other, then we can face anything that comes." The crowd cheered, their voices rising in affirmation and celebration, and as Alara looked out over the sea of faces, she saw hope reflected back at her, genuine belief that the future would be better than the past, because they were all committed to making it so. Kyle's hand found hers, their fingers interlacing automatically, and through the bond, she felt his contentment, his pride in what they had accomplished together, his gratitude for the second chance he had been given to become the wolf he was always meant to be. As the sun set over the Blood Moon Palace, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Alara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace and prosperity. She thought about the frightened Omega, who had dared to challenge a tyrant, about the broken Alpha who had finally found the courage to heal, about the impossible bond that had formed between them and changed not just their lives, but the fate of an entire kingdom. The path had not been easy, would never be easy because meaningful change required constant effort and vigilance. But it had been worth every struggle, every setback, every moment of doubt. They had proven that redemption was possible, that love could transform even the hardest hearts, that balance between opposing forces created something stronger and more beautiful than either could achieve alone. And as she stood there with her mate beside her and their daughter between them, surrounded by wolves who had learned to believe in a better future, Ilara knew with absolute certainty that they had not just saved the kingdom from darkness, but had illuminated a path forward that would guide generations to come. The Alpha King everyone feared had become the leader everyone respected, and the Omega Healer, who had dared to call him by his name, had become the Luna who helped him remember his humanity. Together they had rewritten the story of their people, transforming fear into hope, violence into justice, and isolation into connection, proving that even in the darkest times, courage and compassion could change the world.